Hi there, my name's Philip Stott. I'm National Secretary of Socialist Party Scotland. We're here today with a number of members, young members of Socialist Party Scotland from Aberdeen, from Glasgow, from Dumfries, from Carnoustie, and they are active in the Young Socialists, which is the youth section of Socialist Party Scotland. And we're speaking to them today, particularly on the issues that are affecting young people, from the question of higher education, to youth unemployment, to the Black Lives Matter and the anti-racist movement, and the fight for a decent living wage, and the need for young people to organise in the trade unions. So there's a number of points that we want to cover today, and I won't spend any more time other than just introduce our speakers, and they will be Maddie Jamieson, followed by William Campbell, followed by Lucas Smith-Grant, and followed by Oisin Duncan. So thanks for watching our video today. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Maddie. Now, Maddie's going to say she's a higher education student at Dundee University, and Maddie's going to be talking about the impact of the crisis on funding for universities. Maddie, how are you?
Hi there, Philip. I'm fine. Yes, I am going to obviously was going to be talking about the impact of the crisis and of quite a number of other things on funding for universities, and that funding obviously depending on a number of international students and international funds. So basically, the funding crisis for general and higher education is, before the coronavirus crisis had been an existing one. It had only been intensified by the COVID crisis, and obviously the international problem that had been occurring with travel and mobility of international students. I think that anybody who's attended any level of comprehensive education already knows that funding for working class attended schools and working class attended areas is very, very poor, and is a huge reason under capitalism for the lack of attainment and academic success achieved by an unfortunate number of the working class. So working class students who achieve the academic grades to attend university can be further hindered by, ridiculous fees, living costs, really unacceptable workload combined from obviously university work, part-time job, and certain extracurricular activities that might have to come along with the course. So universities such as those in Dundee, so I go to Dundee University, have been massively affected by the funding crisis, which in part had been caused by a number of international students being unable or refusing to travel back or pay fees. This is due to the fact that quite a majority of the classes that are taking place next semester will be fully online. So a lot of them don't feel, there is a lot of debate being kind of made over fees and the origin, obviously the origin of fees and everything. And for a lot of universities, these fees from international students, which can reach up to about £30,000, for 2 semesters, it's quite a large amount of their funding. So international students are basically seen as cash cows by universities, with this unbelievable amount of money being made from them. They are, however, not properly being looked after during the crisis. This is especially true for those who may have to stay in the UK due to work or visa requirements. There have been payouts made for UK students. There have been extra loans given to UK students. This sort of loan really hasn't been offered as much to international students. It is kind of been expected unfairly by a lot of universities that a majority of international students would go and obviously go back to where they had come from, and then would have automatically the money there for themselves. That is not true, of course, for all international students. This has been commented on by a number of workers' unions, most notably Unison. Unison have demanded that the government tunnel extra funds into universities, who obviously, and a number of them may go into administration due to this crisis. They've stated that a world without universities would be tragic. These industries going into administration would plunge, obviously, the UK economy even further into debt and even further into its already existing problems. And obviously this, what's happening with the universities, where lessons are being sort of taught mostly on computer. I've found that I'd learned a couple of days ago that all of my lectures and seminars next semester will be taught online. Is that a number of first-year students are actually looking to defer, or not looking to come if they can't be taught in class and if they can't see each other face to face. So that is even more, obviously, funding and even more money from students that the universities cannot find. And I'm sure that's not just true for Dundee, I'm sure that's true for a number of universities. So UK and international students might also be affected by a number of cancellations and delays on the essential qualifications needed for students. Obviously, for those going into university, the release of predicted A-levels may be delayed. Obviously, you've got this thing where they're getting grades based off of their performance in the year, where for a lot of people that isn't really indicative of how they have performed in the year. So students may be getting grades and relatively late that really don't represent properly their working style or their actual grade. So as well as this, you've got your TOEFL English language test, obviously, which is required of all international students. So international students, before they go to a UK university, must take this English language test to be accepted in. It's being repeatedly cancelled for a number of people taking it. There's a lot of problems with that test at the moment, meaning that overseas students might miss out on their requirements by that one tiny test, which really, really is not ideal. So, sort of in conclusion, capitalism has hindered funding for university and has forced international students to provide a huge, huge amount of funding for universities. So under a socialised system, universities would be automatically funded. You know, under capitalism, university education is considered essential only for higher paying jobs. It's not really considered a way of broadening horizons and a way of sort of deepening intelligence for certain positions anymore. It's really considered a way for individuals to go in, get back out again, and then find a job with more money. It's sweeping aside, obviously, as well, often important manual labour jobs which don't require university. And basically, what can be said is that only under socialism would universities be fully funded. You would not need to attend to a university to have a fully paying, a good paying job, you know, a good income, a good standard of living. And it's only under capitalism that this university funding crisis can proceed and does exist. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maddie. I think that's really given an excellent, really visual and idea of just the crisis that's coming in terms of higher education. And we do know, of course, the levels of debt that young people are getting into just to have the so-called privilege of attending university. So I think that's really, really important points that you've made there. Now, if we just maybe move on to William. Now, William, as I said, is based up in Carnoustie. And William is going to be telling us a little bit, I think, about the question of unemployment and maybe what's coming down the line for young people, young workers in particular, who seem to be getting thrown out of work at an alarming rate. And I've no doubt that William will touch on some of those points. So, William, how is the current economic position affecting young people?
Thanks, Philip. And well, I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but it's not looking positive at all. Not for anyone, but particularly for young people in the next coming periods. Now, unemployment in Scotland has always been a contentious issue that's always been at sometimes as high as 20% as last year. But as of May this year in 2020, unemployment reached to about 113,000 people, which triggered a massive bailout by the Scottish Government, led by the SNP, the Greens and so on, to carry out a £33 million furlough scheme in order to help furlough jobs across the private sector. And what this has done is essentially kept jobs afloat. But what this hasn't done is actually stopped the number of jobs that are being lost, particularly in areas such as in hospitality and in airlines. Now, for a lot of young people, especially, hospitality work is often a very crucial job, not just for those who are going to college and university to keep them afloat, but it's one of the very few avenues where young people can enter the workplace without needing years and years worth of experience, which is often quite a common trope, unfortunately, for a lot of young people when they apply for entry-level jobs that are often very low pay. They ask them for nearly half a decade's worth of experience for people who have just left high school. So the odds are stacked against young people, and that's only in the last previous decade. In the coming decade, the economic recession that we're going through, and certainly the economic depression that's coming, is going to be hugely impactful for the number of young people trying to get into work. Now, I know Maddie talked about higher education, and the prospects really for higher education students as well is similar. You know, we're seeing the cutting down of jobs across all sectors. Now, in places such as the northeast of Scotland, and the west coast of Scotland, you have sectors such as the airlines that have been hugely crucial to employing young people. And those jobs are facing massive cuts from just because of the role that coronavirus has played. Now, I don't want to make the mistake, however, in saying the coronavirus has caused this economic crisis, because this economic crisis prior to corona was already coming down the pipelines. The amount of debt that's in the public sector and the amount of debt in the battles that have been placed internationally between Russia and Saudi Arabia, with the battle between oil prices, has had a huge detrimental effect on the oil sector in Scotland, and as well as the trade wars between America and China. That also trickles down into places like in Scotland. So for y'all young workers, it seems like it's almost out of their hands in a way. These big multinationals and big superpowers of the world essentially playing a game with their lives. And for us in the Young Socialists, we take a stand against that sort of injustice, you know, and this unemployment phenomenon that we're seeing in Scotland, which is going to at least double. The supposedly 115,000 people that I just mentioned that were unemployed in May. Now, those unemployment statistics have been updated, but they will soon be either the end of this month or the start of August, and I have no doubt it will be as high as 120, 130,000. And for a lot of economists, whether it's in the Financial Times, which is sort of like the rag, the paper written by the capitalists in Britain, or any other sort of news outlet like the BBC, many economists are predicting that the number of unemployment throughout the UK is going to double. And for here in Scotland, we already have one of the worst unemployment records already. So it's not great. It's quite bleak for a lot of young workers. And that phenomenon, however, it's not concentrated within Scotland. We're seeing unemployment hugely across the world, whether it's across the European Union, where they're facing a crisis with the Eurozone, particularly in a lot of Eastern European countries, like in Lithuania, where unemployment is as high as nearly 40% for young people, as well as across Africa, South America, and as well as North America and the rest of the world. Unemployment phenomenon that we're seeing in Scotland is intrinsically linked to a system that is perpetuating the same injustice, and that is the system of profit, the system of capitalism. And for us in the Young Socialists, we see the need to develop and to organise unemployed young people into unions, whether it's Unite Communities, which is engaged in trying to organise those that are unemployment or on benefits and so on, but also the need to link that struggle against unemployment to the struggle against the system that perpetuates that injustice. For us in Young Socialists, we say we need to join the trade unions. Whether you're unemployed, you can join Unite Communities or similar unions across the world that organise people. We ask you to join the Young Socialists in the fight against unemployment. In the future, the Young Socialists, we're hoping to start up a campaign for Youth Fight for Jobs. We want to organise protests and demos of young people, to organise and to demand proper jobs with trade unionised agreements to ensure that we won't be the lost generation that will have been left out, only simply because these big multinationals, whether they're in the airlines, whether it's G1 in the hospitality sector, or even the big governments and the big banks of today, are willing to throw down the entire future to young people just so that they can maintain their profits. We say no to that. We say no to the unfettered profits. We say yes to a nationalised economy that is centrally planned, democratically controlled by workers and young people to ensure that people can have proper jobs for life, as well as homes, and bringing back grants as well, such as living grants, the cutting of council fees, and so on and so forth. Actually bringing back a socialist programme that can be used to help improve the lives of young people and to ensure that we will never ever once again have another generation that falls into the pits of poverty and is stuck there for an entire generation. We say no to that, and we ask you, if you find that interesting, if you want to get involved, join Young Socialists and join in the fight back against mass unemployment and save proper jobs for all. Thanks.
Thanks very much, William. I think that's a really good kind of summary of the type of work that the Young Socialist is doing on the question of young workers' jobs. And our next contribution is going to be actually linked to this theme about the rights of young workers for a proper living wage and the right to be in a trade union to fight for proper terms and conditions at work. Now, Lucas is based in Aberdeen. He's a student, but also a young worker as well. So, Lucas, what's your views in terms of the issues around decent wages and trade unionisation for young workers?
Hi, Philip. Yeah, so I mean, certainly in the past months, we've seen many companies pulling out all of the stops in an effort to kind of mitigate disaster within their respective companies, their industries, and in the economy as a whole, both domestically and internationally. In an effort to achieve such ends, different industries have used different methods, of course. In retail, we're seeing mass understaffing, reluctance to order products, leading to kind of bare shelves, and quite obviously the prospects of across the board pay increases have been blown out of the water for the time being. Just in the past few days, Boots, a big retail chain, they've announced 4,000 redundancies across the country due to fallen sales profits. In other sectors, redundancies have, of course, become all too common. Many jobs are in jeopardy in oil and gas, as well as in the transport industry and many others. It must be emphasised, though, that this preservation efforts that the capitalists are using is simply an effort, and it's simply an effort to protect their profits and the interests of their class, and not those of workers. It has become increasingly clear that workers are an afterthought in the pandemic, both in Scotland, in the rest of the UK, and in the world as a whole, being used as scapegoats and cannon fodder for the whims and interests of the rich and powerful. Boris Johnson only just recently blatantly cast the blame. Of course, sure we remember in the news of the deaths in care homes onto care homes themselves, with his government scrambling to justify his remarks with clammy hands. Their ideological assurance that they have done nothing wrong in their handling of the coronavirus pandemic drives this. We can recall Priti Patel's apology that we feel that they have failed in their handling, and that's just one upon the pile of shortfallings in public relations over the past few months by Johnson's government. It's clear that the handouts offered by the capitalists and their governments are worthless and just not extensive enough. The cold fact is that these handouts can simply be taken back when it suits the government or the capitalists to do so. These blatant attacks on jobs, livelihoods, and very importantly, prospects for working class people are unacceptable, and they must be fought against. Things will likely get much worse by the end of the year, with prospects set to drop by up to 30% for low to medium skilled workers, many of whom are young workers, of course. Now, in the next years, as a consequence of further economic hardship and recession, these prospects will become even more sparse for all workers. Poverty wages and falling conditions are likely to follow or continue, making the need to fight for workers' voices to be heard all the more important. Workers can do this by joining appropriate trade unions in their sectors, such as USDOF for retail, Unite for industrial work or hospitality, among many others for respective industries. Becoming active members within these trade unions can also go a long way in making real strides against the boss's cold repression of conditions and under repression of calls for increased pay in the interests of their profit motive. Through becoming trade union reps and shop stewards, and through unionising your workplace, can the fight for workers' rights be brought forward leaps and bounds. The current wages offered by bosses are not enough to even cover the most basic sense of financial security amidst low-skilled work, and the prospects of massive stagnation under the Tories are becoming increasingly likely, with their pledge of £10.05 an hour, which is in truth a wage reduction by the plan 2024. What is needed for all workers is £12 an hour, and as a transitional demand to a £15 an hour wage that the trade unions should and must fight for to deliver to workers in the near future. The power possessed by workers in a unionised workplace can be a real force for change. And if this extends to most of an industry or multiple workplaces, this power can be immense in fighting for better pay and conditions. Trade unions should demand companies open their books to them in order to properly assess the choices they make, such as redundancy, and be willing to call industrial action against these companies when demands are not met or choices made that impact the livelihood of the workforce. We appeal to all young workers to become involved in the Young Socialist Young Workers' Rights Campaign and to join a trade union. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucas. Some really important points there about how crucial it is for young people to be active in the trade union movement, to help build that movement, and not just to join a union, but to make sure that the unions are prepared to fight and take on the bosses when it comes to this avalanche of attacks that are facing working class people on the back of the COVID crisis. Now, one of the most inspiring issues really that has exploded across the world in the last few weeks has been the Black Lives Matter movement, which began, of course, in the United States after the murder of George Floyd by the police officers in the US. But it spread across the globe, and it really said something, I think, first of all, about the preparedness of young people to come out onto the streets to protest against racism and inequality, but it also raises issues about what type of society we need to fight for in order to end racism and discrimination permanently. Now, Oshin, who's based in Glasgow and also a student at Glasgow University, is going to maybe give us a little bit of an insight into that movement and what the Young Socialist has to say about the fight against racism itself. Oshin.
Cheers, Philip. Thanks for the introduction there, and thanks to the other comrades for making really brilliant points on different topics. I'm going to start with kind of a analysis of the history of capitalism and the role that racism has played in that, because I think it's important that we sort of put our position out there so people can understand where we're coming from. And I'll just start with British capitalism, obviously, because that's the most relevant thing to young people in Scotland. I mean, the beginning of British capitalism was really built on the slave trade. Karl Marx pointed out that because of primitive accumulation and also the involvement of many European powers, but especially the UK, in the Atlantic slave trade, that capitalism was birthed dripping, head to toe in blood. I think that's absolutely true. Really, if you look into the history, the discovery and the colonization of the Americas allowed European countries, as I said, like Spain, Portugal, France, and particularly the UK, to use chattel slavery on plantations to grow the cash crops of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And then through trading those commodities, they created the capital, which flowed back to Britain and built up cities like Liverpool, like Belfast, where I'm from, through the linen mills, which obviously require cotton, and of course Glasgow, where I'm based. If you look in the merchant city, you'll see a lot of the older buildings were built by tobacco merchants and sugar merchants and things like that. And those were obviously slave industries. And incidentally, that's when, during that period and during that process, that's when the first Black British communities began to form in cities like Liverpool in particular. And obviously the labour done on those plantations was mostly done by African slaves, as well as some indigenous Americans who were being enslaved by the colonists as well. And ships involved in the Atlantic slave trade frequented British ports like Bristol to trade slaves and then take them to the new colonies. The money that was brought in by the slave trade through again trading commodities like cigarettes and sugar paid for the training and the arming of the British Navy and the Army. And indeed, slave labour was directly used to clothe the sailors and the soldiers with cotton and to produce the material for sails and so on. And the economic advantages of using black slaves forced the ruling class of Britain and other European countries, and later on the US capitalist class, to invent pseudoscientific and social justifications for the totally immoral treatment of African people, and to spread those ideas amongst the white workers in their own nations, which is a classic example, we would say, of divide and rule on behalf of the capitalists, which was repeated again and again. And that process of inventing justifications based on false race science has continued right up until today, with American capitalism in particular having to repeatedly reorganize the way in which Black people are oppressed and exploited. The American Revolution and the Bolivarian independence struggles, which happened in Latin America, changed little for the African slaves already living in the Americas and being brought there. Prominent founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, who's on dollar bills in America, he owned hundreds of slaves, directly profited from the dehumanization, despite actually expressing awareness of the immoral nature of slavery in his own writings. Even when the Industrial Revolution began to increase the rate of exploitation of wage labor relative to slave labor and basically made it more efficient to employ wage workers in a factory rather than use slave labor on a plantation. And as well as that, actually you had rebellions and revolutions of Black people in the Caribbean, particularly the Dragoons in Jamaica, made it very difficult for the British Empire to continue their colonization, and the Haitian Revolution against the French imperial rule was the first and largest, well, not really the first, but the largest successful slave revolt in modern history. But the contradiction between the old system of slave labor and the new industrialized method of wage labor led to the outbreak of the US Civil War between the North and the South, and the post-war Reconstruction still had to force Black people into a second-class citizen status. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery everywhere except in prisons, was used to force Black people into the prison system so their labor could still be used for free. And that, plus then later on, the civil discrimination of Jim Crow and segregation further oppressed Black people as a whole, and also had the effect of dividing the American working class along racial lines, which marginalized a lot of the most militant voices within the working class, who were Black people. But even, moving on to the longest boom in capitalism's history, which stretched from the end of the Second World War up until the end of the 70s and into the 80s almost, Black workers from the neo-colonial world, particularly the Commonwealth and the Caribbean, were brought back to rebuild imperial nations. So if we move back to Britain and the post-war Attlee Labour government, which has been well praised obviously for building the welfare state and in particular the National Health Service. However, much of the labour used to construct those institutions was done by immigrants from the Commonwealth and in particular South Asia, excuse me, and the Caribbean. Those workers were subjected to racism coming both from the British state itself in the form of racist citizenship laws right up until the Windrush scandal, which just 2 years ago broke in 2018, as well as their new white neighbours. There are many important differences, obviously, with the racism experienced by Black Americans, but British society is just as racist, as can be shown by the prominence of slave trader statues and their names on streets all over the country. That was reflected in the huge outpouring of righteous anger in this country after George Floyd's murder, as Philip rightly pointed out. And police clearly haven't learned their lesson, as just last week they harassed an Olympic athlete, Bianca Campbell, for 45 minutes, along with her partner and 3-month-old baby in the car, just because she's a young Black person who drives a nice car, so she must be a criminal. These are the kind of ideas that govern the capitalist state's apparatus, and how they treat Black people, as well as basically all minority ethnic people. So from there, I'll move on to why. Something that Will pointed out in a jobs guarantee scheme to deal with unemployment, why that needs to be considered really as a socialist program if it's going to work to undercut the far right and racist, but also to serve Black people in the way that they need to be that they need to be served. So as Will went through, the British and Scottish economy looks like there will be huge job losses, the national lockdown, the global implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're predicted to have disastrous impacts. Already massive job cuts have hit the hospitality sector in particular in Scotland, with thousands of jobs already being lost, and that's likely to hit young workers hardest, as we've made clear in our recent articles on the matter. And that could actually exacerbate existing inequalities between white and BAME workers. The unequal death and infection rate of BAME workers has been talked about during the pandemic. And much of the reasoning behind this stems from the fact that BAME workers are often concentrated in public sector jobs like transport services and the National Health Service. That has exposed those workers more to COVID than their white colleagues, and furthermore demonstrates an important divide between Black and brown workers and their white colleagues. That divide was also exposed last year in the UCU's Four Fights, One Voice campaign for equal pay, as it was revealed in their material that in higher education, older white men make much more than their BAME and female colleagues. They're more likely to be considered for promotion, and they're also more likely to be interviewed and accepted for jobs. It's just an absolutely systemic racist problem that Black people and also women, of course, but obviously that's not racist, that's more misogynist, but there's a huge problem with equality in higher education, as well as across the entire economy. And we would say the best way to offset that is to organize in the workplace, and to organize for things like guaranteeing trade union rates of pay, as well as paths for career progression, and addressing the lack of opportunities for BAME youth. Socialist Party Scotland see a democratically planned economy as the best way to undercut the basis of racism in society. The first step to this, moving out of lockdown, will be to guarantee jobs not on the basis of disaster capitalism, which again my comrades have gone through, but I'll just reiterate. Capitalism cannot provide decent housing, wages, or conditions for young workers and the working class as a whole, but on trade union level rates of pay, above a national minimum wage of £12 an hour, and with the legitimate possibility for career progress, we could actually address a lot of the problems that young people, and particularly BAME young people, face. This scheme must be subject to the democratic oversight of the trade union membership and BAME caucuses within unions like Unite and Unison, which are the biggest private and public sector unions respectively. They should be given the power of review over how this scheme serves its members, and particularly the Black and minority ethnic members. So that's all I have at the minute, but cheers.
Thanks very much, Oisín. And I think what we've heard loud and clear from all four of the contributions in the video has been the utter incapacity of capitalism and the profit system to really deal with all of the issues that face young people today, whether that is the issues of racism, of unemployment, of low pay, of exploitation, of debt going into higher education, and whether there will be a sustainable higher education system going forward because of the phenomenal attacks and cuts that we expect to take place. So I think that I'd like to thank all four of the contributors to our video today. Now, you might, after hearing these contributions, be interested in getting involved in the Young Socialists and in Socialist Party Scotland and joining us really in the fight for the society that we need to build, which is one based on where the working class majority own and control the means to produce wealth, that we redistribute that wealth and we plan for the majority. Rather than planning for profit, we plan for the interests of working class people across the world. Now, you can do that by going to, for example, the Young Socialists, Young Workers' Rights Facebook page, which you'll find on Facebook. We also have Instagram and social media accounts like Twitter as well. But you can also read more of our analysis, our programme, what we do day to day, week to week, by visiting the website, socialistpartyscotland.org.uk, to find out more about the need for young people today, as William explained, not to be the lost generation, not to be left behind because of the crisis of the capitalist system. So thanks very much for listening. Please come and consider getting yourself involved in the Young Socialists here in Scotland. Get involved in the fight for socialism, fight for your future. We've got a world to win. Let's go and let's get organised. Thanks for listening.